December 7th, 1944. 40 miles south of the Rhine River, Captain Jack Ilfrey pulls his P-47 Thunderbolt into a steep banking turn, his eyes locked on a formation of 12 Messerschmitt 109s climbing to intercept him at 20,000 feet. Every instinct honed through 18 months of aerial combat screams at him to engage. Above Schweinfurt, he'd destroyed 3 German fighters in a single engagement. Over Hamburg, he'd saved his wingman by diving into a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s without hesitation. But today, Ilfrey does something that violates every fighter pilot's deepest instinct. He ignores them completely. Instead, he pushes his stick forward, diving away from the enemy fighters toward the snow-covered roads of western Germany, where intelligence reports indicate a massive convoy of Wehrmacht supply trucks streaming eastward. The German pilots follow him down, confident they're chasing a coward who's abandoned the fight. They have no idea they're watching the birth of a tactical revolution that will destroy 800 German trucks in 7 days and starve an entire army of fuel, ammunition, and hope. For 3 years, Allied fighter pilots had measured success by aircraft destroyed, pilots killed, and dogfights won. But in the frozen December of 1944, as Germany's final offensive exploded through the Ardennes forest, American commanders realized that killing enemy pilots accomplished nothing if German tanks still rolled forward on roads packed with supply vehicles that nobody was attacking. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant General Pete Quesada stood in his command trailer at Advanced Landing Ground, a 6-4 near Chievres, Belgium, at 0300 hours on December 16, 1944, studying reconnaissance photographs that documented the intelligence failure of the war. The images showed German columns stretching for miles through the Ardennes forest, thousands of vehicles moving with mechanical precision through terrain that Allied planners had dismissed as impassable for large-scale armoured operations. Quesada commanded the 9th Tactical Air Command, responsible for providing air support to Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army. His 375 fighter bombers, primarily P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, represented the most powerful tactical air force ever assembled. But those aircraft had been positioned to support an Allied offensive that no longer existed, their bases scattered across eastern Belgium and southern Holland, too far from the German breakthrough to provide immediate response. The photographs told a story of catastrophic Allied miscalculation. For weeks, German troops had been massing in the Eifel region under strict radio silence and elaborate camouflage discipline that defeated Allied intelligence collection. Now, 21 divisions, including 10 Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions, were pouring through a 60-mile gap in American lines, driving westward toward the Meuse River and the vital port of Antwerp. Quesada traced his finger along the reconnaissance images, identifying the crucial vulnerability that would define his response. The German offensive depended entirely on captured Allied fuel supplies to sustain its momentum. Wehrmacht planning documents, later recovered from destroyed vehicles, revealed that panzer divisions carried only enough fuel for 100 miles of combat operations, approximately half the distance to Antwerp. Every German tank, every armoured vehicle, every motorized artillery piece would run dry within days unless supply columns could deliver fuel from depots east of the Rhine. Major General Elwood Pete Quesada possessed an unusual background for a tactical air commander. Before the war, he had worked as a staff civilian aviation consultant, developing air traffic control systems and studying the logistics of commercial transport operations. That experience had taught him to view air power not just as a means of destroying enemy forces, but as a system for disrupting the flow of supplies that sustained military operations. He pulled out casualty reports from the opening day of the German offensive. The U.S. 106th Infantry Division had effectively ceased to exist, with 2 entire regiments surrounded and forced to surrender. The 28th Infantry Division had been shattered across a 20-mile front. Provisional battle groups formed from rear echelon troops were attempting to hold key road junctions against veteran panzer units that possessed overwhelming firepower and tactical expertise. But Quesada's attention focused on different numbers. Intelligence estimates indicated that German forces were consuming 400,000 gallons of fuel per day during active combat operations. That fuel had to come from somewhere, transported in trucks that travelled on roads that could be seen from the air and attacked by aircraft that possessed complete freedom of movement once weather conditions permitted flying operations. Colonel Gilbert Myers, Quesada's operations officer, ducked into the command trailer carrying weather forecasts that offered the first encouraging news in 36 hours. "Sir, meteorology predicts clearing conditions beginning December 23rd, high-pressure system moving in from the Atlantic. We should have 4 to 5 days of clear weather for maximum effort operations." Quesada studied the forecast charts with the focused attention of a commander who understood that weather was about to become the decisive factor in the campaign. The German offensive had been deliberately timed to exploit the winter storm systems that blanketed Western Europe from mid-December through early January, grounding Allied air power and neutralizing the overwhelming numerical advantage that American and British forces enjoyed in tactical aviation. "Gil, I want every available aircraft configured for ground attack operations. Remove auxiliary fuel tanks, maximum bomb and rocket loads, and I want pilots briefed on a new target priority system." Quesada's voice carried the certainty of a commander who had identified the enemy's critical vulnerability. Myers consulted his squadron status boards, noting the current mission assignments that reflected traditional fighter-bomber doctrine. "Sir, standing orders prioritize enemy aircraft, then armored vehicles, then transportation targets. Are you proposing we reverse that priority?" "I'm proposing we ignore enemy aircraft entirely unless they're directly threatening our formations." Quesada tapped the reconnaissance photographs showing German supply columns. "Look at these images. Hundreds of trucks, staff cars, fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, all moving on predictable routes during daylight hours because the Luftwaffe can't provide air cover for such dispersed targets. The concept violated fundamental assumptions about air superiority that had governed Allied air operations since D-Day. American fighter pilots had been trained to view enemy aircraft as their primary targets, with ground attack missions considered secondary responsibilities that were performed only after air-to-air threats had been eliminated. The entire fighter pilot culture, from training doctrine to combat decorations, emphasized aerial victories over ground attack effectiveness. Colonel Myers framed the doctrinal challenge with brutal clarity. "General, every fighter pilot in this command has been taught that air superiority is the prerequisite for successful ground operations. If we order them to ignore German fighters, we're asking them to abandon 3 years of tactical doctrine and personal instinct." Quesada walked to the operations map, where colored pins marked German penetrations that now extended 30 miles into Allied lines. "Air superiority is meaningless if German tanks are rolling through our positions because we let their supply trucks deliver fuel unopposed. The Luftwaffe has maybe 200 operational fighters in this sector. We have nearly 400. The mathematical superiority means we can absorb fighter attacks while still accomplishing ground attack missions." He pulled out ammunition expenditure reports from recent fighter-bomber missions that illustrated the inefficiency of traditional target priorities. When our pilots encounter enemy fighters, they burn through their ammunition in aerial combat, then return to base without ever attacking ground targets. Meanwhile, German supply trucks continue rolling eastward, delivering the fuel and ammunition that sustain the offensive. The mathematical logic was inescapable, but implementation would require overcoming deeply ingrained pilot instincts and training. Fighter pilots measured their worth by aerial victories. Aces with 5 or more kills earned recognition, media attention, and promotion opportunities that ground attack specialists could never achieve. Asking pilots to ignore enemy aircraft meant asking them to sacrifice personal glory for strategic effectiveness, a psychological challenge that military training rarely addressed. Quesada dictated Operations Order 1247 to his staff stenographer, creating the document that would transform tactical air doctrine throughout the European theatre. "All fighter-bomber squadrons will prioritize transportation targets, specifically motorized transport, fuel tankers, and supply vehicles. Enemy aircraft will be engaged only when directly threatening friendly forces or when no ground targets are available. Pilots will be evaluated on ground targets destroyed rather than aerial victories achieved. The final sentence represented revolutionary thinking in an air force that still lionized First World War aces and treated fighter combat as the pinnacle of military aviation. By changing how pilots were evaluated and rewarded, Quesada was attempting to reshape an entire military culture through administrative directive, a process that would prove far more difficult than simply issuing orders. At 0800 hours on December 23rd, as weather forecasts had predicted, the winter storm system broke apart over Belgium, revealing clear skies and unlimited visibility that stretched from the English Channel to the German frontier. Quesada's fighter bombers began launching from airfields across Belgium and northern France, 350 aircraft configured for maximum ground attack effectiveness rather than aerial combat superiority. Captain Jack Ilfrey led the 79th Fighter Group's initial mission, 12 P-47 Thunderbolts carrying two 500-pound bombs each, plus full loads of 50 caliber ammunition intended for strafing attacks. At 34, Ilfrey was older than most fighter pilots, his combat experience dating back to North Africa in 1942. He had achieved 8 confirmed aerial victories, qualifying him as an ace and earning him the respect that came with successful fighter combat. But the mission briefing he had received that morning represented a complete reversal of everything he had learned about fighter operations. Primary targets are motorized transport on roads leading to German frontline positions. Secondary targets are rail facilities and storage depots. Tertiary targets are enemy aircraft only if they directly threaten mission accomplishment. The briefing officer had emphasized the target priority with unusual insistence, making clear that this represented theater-level policy rather than local initiative. Ilfrey's formation crossed into German-held territory at 12,000 feet, immediately spotting a Messerschmitt 109 formation, climbing to intercept from an airfield near St. Vith. Every instinct developed through 30 months of aerial combat demanded that he turn into the threat, gain altitude advantage, and engage the enemy fighters before they could threaten his formation. But Operations Order 1247 was explicit. Enemy aircraft will be engaged only when directly threatening friendly forces. The German fighters were 5 miles away and climbing through 8,000 feet, at least 90 seconds from effective firing range. Ilfrey made the hardest decision of his combat career. He pushed his stick forward, diving toward a road junction south of Stavelot where reconnaissance photographs had shown heavy vehicle traffic moving eastward. Behind him, Lieutenant Bobby Hendricks transmitted the question that every pilot in the formation was thinking. "Lead, we've got bandits climbing to intercept. Are we engaging?" "Negative. Stay in formation. We're going after ground targets." Ilfrey's voice carried none of the uncertainty he felt about abandoning every tactical principle he had learned. The German fighters followed them down, exactly as Ilfrey had anticipated. But the Messerschmitt 109's dive performance was inferior to the P-47 Thunderbolt's massive airframe and powerful engine. By the time the German formation reached firing range, Ilfrey's flight was already at 2,000 feet, approaching a convoy of 23 trucks and fuel tankers that stretched for half a mile along a narrow forest road. Ilfrey's first bomb struck directly among the convoy's center vehicles, the explosion detonating fuel tankers and creating a fireball that engulfed 8 trucks in secondary explosions. His second bomb hit the road surface ahead of the lead vehicles, cratering the pavement and blocking the convoy's escape route. Then he pulled into a strafing run, his 850 caliber machine guns raking the stalled vehicles with concentrated fire that punctured fuel tanks and ignited cargo loads. The German fighters overhead faced an impossible tactical dilemma. Diving to engage the American aircraft meant descending to altitudes where the P-47's superior low-level performance negated any advantage the lighter Messerschmitts possessed. The American fighters were also operating at high speed and in close proximity to the ground, making aerial gunnery extremely difficult, even for experienced pilots. More importantly, attacking the American formation would require flying through the smoke and debris from the burning convoy, creating visibility problems and collision hazards that made coordinated fighter attacks nearly impossible. The German pilots circled overhead, firing occasional bursts that accomplished nothing beyond expending ammunition, while Ilfrey's flight systematically destroyed every vehicle in the convoy. Lieutenant Hendricks recorded his impressions in the mission debriefing that afternoon. "We spent maybe 4 minutes over the target. Destroyed 23 vehicles, including 5 fuel tankers. German fighters overhead the whole time. But they couldn't engage effectively while we were at deck level working over the convoy. When we climbed back out, they were already heading home, probably low on fuel from trying to chase us down. The tactical revelation was profound. By operating at extremely low altitude while attacking ground targets, American fighters created a defensive bubble that German aircraft found nearly impossible to penetrate. The ground itself became a protective barrier, limiting approach angles and creating background clutter that degraded German gunnery effectiveness. Combined with the P-47's superior dive and low-altitude performance, this meant American formations could attack ground targets with relative impunity, even in the presence of enemy fighters. By 1600 hours on December 23rd, 9th Tactical Air Command had flown 423 ground attack sorties, claiming 916 vehicles destroyed or damaged. German supply columns throughout the Tembold, Ardennes region found themselves under continuous aerial attack whenever they moved during daylight hours, forcing fundamental changes in Wehrmacht logistics operations. Major Joseph Dillon, intelligence officer for the 9th Tactical Air Command, analyzed gun camera footage and pilot reports to identify patterns in German response to the new American tactics. "Sir, the Luftwaffe is repositioning fighters to provide closer escort for supply columns, but their aircraft are tied to protecting specific convoys rather than conducting free-ranging fighter sweeps. They've effectively ceded air superiority to protect ground targets." Quesada studied the intelligence summaries with satisfaction. "That's exactly what we want. Every German fighter escorting trucks is one less fighter threatening our bomber formations or providing reconnaissance. We've forced them into a defensive posture that plays to our numerical superiority." The psychological impact on German fighter pilots became evident. Through intercepted radio communications and interrogations of captured airmen, Luftwaffe pilots, trained to view aerial combat as the pinnacle of military achievement, found themselves reduced to defensive convoy escort duties that offered no opportunities for the individual glory that their culture emphasized. Worse, they were losing aircraft to American anti-aircraft fire while attempting to protect supply columns rather than in honest aerial combat. Hauptmann Franz Stigler, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot with 28 confirmed victories, would later describe the psychological burden of the new American tactics. "We were hunters being forced to act as shepherds. Every instinct told us to climb, engage the enemy fighters, and prove our superiority in aerial combat. Instead, we circled supply convoys like nervous hens, watching American fighters destroy trucks while we were powerless to intervene effectively." But the true test of Quesada's tactical revolution was about to begin. German commanders, recognizing the catastrophic vulnerability of daylight supply operations, would implement countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize American air superiority and restore the Wehrmacht's ability to sustain offensive operations through threatened territory. December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1944. The temperature dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, as Colonel Glenn Duncan led the 353rd Fighter Group on a dawn patrol over the Ardennes forest. Duncan, whose thick moustache and perpetual cigar made him look more like a Hollywood actor than a fighter pilot, had achieved 19 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the most successful American aces in the European theater. But today's mission represented a fundamental challenge to everything that had defined his combat career. Operations Order 1247 directed him to prioritize transportation targets over enemy aircraft, measuring success by trucks destroyed rather than aerial victories achieved. For a pilot whose entire identity revolved around fighter-to-fighter combat, this represented not just a tactical adjustment, but a psychological transformation. Duncan's formation of 16 P-47 Thunderbolts crossed the bomb line at 0700 hours, immediately encountering weather conditions that made ground attack operations extraordinarily dangerous. Low clouds at 3,000 feet limited visibility and created icing conditions that accumulated on wing surfaces and reduced aircraft performance. Below the cloud deck, German anti-aircraft crews had positioned flak batteries at every major road junction, creating interlocking fields of fire that turned supply routes into aerial gauntlets. The first vehicle convoy appeared at 07:20 hours, approximately 40 trucks moving in close formation along a forest road south of Haufelais. Duncan led his flight down through the cloud layer, emerging at 1,500 feet, directly over the target area. German anti-aircraft fire immediately erupted from concealed positions, 88mm guns and 20mm cannons, creating a curtain of exploding steel that filled the sky with black smoke and shrapnel. Duncan's wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Mickey Flynn, took a direct hit during the first strafing pass. The 88mm shell penetrated his engine nacelle and detonated among the Thunderbolt's fuel lines, transforming the aircraft into a fireball that cartwheeled across the frozen landscape. Flynn's last radio transmission consisted of 3 words before impact. "Jesus, I'm hit." The loss shocked the formation. Flynn had survived 47 combat missions, including the desperate air battles over Germany during Big Week in February 1944. He possessed the experience and skill that should have ensured survival in any normal combat situation. But ground attack operations against heavily defended targets represented a different kind of warfare, one where skill and experience provided minimal protection against massed anti-aircraft fire. Duncan pressed the attack, his 850 caliber machine guns destroying 5 trucks before climbing back into the cloud layer to escape the concentrated flak. But the psychological toll of Flynn's death weighed heavily on pilots who understood that attacking ground targets exposed them to defensive fire far more deadly than anything they faced in aerial combat. German anti-aircraft defenses throughout the Ardennes had been dramatically reinforced following the devastating American air attacks of December 23. Wehrmacht commanders positioned mobile flak batteries at every major road junction and supply route, creating layered defenses that forced American fighters to penetrate multiple fire zones during each attack run. The 88mm guns, originally designed as anti-tank weapons, proved devastatingly effective against low-flying aircraft, their high-velocity shells capable of destroying a fighter with a single direct hit. By mid-afternoon on Christmas Eve, 9th Tactical Air Command had lost 11 aircraft to anti-aircraft fire while destroying an estimated 230 vehicles. The exchange ratio was favorable from a strategic perspective, but the human cost was creating morale problems among pilots who resented being ordered to attack ground targets that offered no opportunity for the individual skill and maneuver that defined aerial combat. Captain Jack Ilfrey confronted the morale crisis during the evening briefing, when several pilots openly questioned the wisdom of continuing ground attack operations in the face of strengthened German defences. "Sir, we're losing experienced pilots to flak guns while German fighters fly overhead untouched. This isn't fighting, it's suicide." The comment came from Lieutenant Dave Walsh, a 22-year-old pilot from Chicago who had arrived in Europe just 6 weeks earlier. His frustration reflected broader resentment among fighter pilots who had been trained to view air-to-air combat as the measure of military effectiveness. Ilfrey walked to the situation map, where coloured pins marked the German advance, which had been halted at its furthest western penetration point. "Dave, I understand your frustration. I spent 2 years building my reputation as a fighter pilot. 8 confirmed kills. But look at these numbers." He pulled out intelligence summaries showing German fuel consumption rates and destroyed vehicle totals. "The German offensive has stalled not because we won dogfights, but because we destroyed the trucks carrying fuel to their tanks. Every supply vehicle we eliminate shortens the range of their panzer divisions. Every fuel tanker we destroy forces their armoured units to halt for resupply. We're winning this battle on the ground, not in the air." The mathematical argument was unanswerable, but it failed to address the psychological reality that fighter pilots measured their worth through aerial victories rather than strategic effectiveness. The military's reward system, from medal citations to promotion boards, emphasized individual combat achievements that could be quantified and compared. Ground attack missions, no matter how strategically important, offered no clear metrics for individual performance evaluation. General Quesada recognized the morale problem and implemented a controversial solution. Beginning December 26th, pilots would receive official credit for ground vehicles destroyed using the same point system traditionally applied to aerial victories. 5 trucks would equal 1 aircraft destroyed for purposes of ACE recognition. 10 trucks would earn a Distinguished Flying Cross recommendation. The policy represented an explicit attempt to reshape pilot motivation through administrative recognition rather than cultural change. The response among fighter pilots was mixed. Some embraced the new system as validation of ground attack work that had previously gone unrewarded. Others viewed it as a cynical attempt to devalue aerial combat expertise by equating truck destruction with the skill required for successful dogfighting. The debate revealed fundamental tensions between traditional fighter pilot culture and the emerging reality of tactical air warfare, where strategic effectiveness mattered more than individual glory. Christmas Day 1944 brought no holiday respite from the grinding air campaign. 375 American fighter bombers flew 692 sorties against German transportation targets throughout the Ardennes, claiming 543 vehicles destroyed. German fuel shortages became critical as supply columns found themselves unable to move during daylight hours without facing certain air attack. Hauptmann Wilhelm Bauer commanded the 6th Panzer Division's Logistical Support Regiment, responsible for delivering fuel and ammunition to armoured units fighting near Bastogne. His after-action report, recovered from German archives after the war, documented the catastrophic impact of American air interdiction. December 25th. Attempted daylight resupply convoy to forward units. 17 fuel tankers and 23 ammunition trucks departed Prüm at 0600 hours. American fighter bombers attacked at 0745. All vehicles destroyed within 8 minutes. No fuel reached forward units. Panzer Battalion immobilized due to lack of fuel. Offensive operations impossible. The strategic mathematics were becoming inescapable. German panzer divisions required approximately 60,000 gallons of fuel per day during active combat operations. Each destroyed fuel tanker represented 4,000 gallons that would never reach the front lines. Simple multiplication revealed that American air attacks were eliminating more fuel capacity than German logistics could replace, creating a downward spiral that would inevitably paralyze the offensive regardless of tactical success on the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Thatcher commanded the 366th Fighter Group, whose P-47 Thunderbolts had been specifically tasked with interdicting supply routes east of St. Vith. At 41, Thatcher was ancient by fighter pilot standards, his greying hair and reading glasses marking him as an anomaly in a profession dominated by men half his age. But his background as a railroad operations manager in civilian life had taught him to think systematically about logistics and transportation networks. Thatcher studied road reconnaissance photographs with the analytical mind of someone who understood that destroying random vehicles accomplished far less than eliminating key choke points that would create cascading failures throughout the enemy supply system. He identified 17 critical road junctions between German supply depots and frontline positions, locations where geographic constraints forced all traffic through single routes that offered no alternative bypasses. Operations Order for December 26 directed concentrated attacks against these bottleneck positions rather than dispersed hunting of individual convoys. The concept represented sophisticated thinking about how to maximize the strategic impact of limited air resources. By destroying bridges, cratering roads, and creating vehicle blockages at key junctions, American fighters could paralyze entire supply networks rather than simply reducing their capacity. The 6th Panzer Army's supply network depended on 3 primary routes that converged at the town of Stadtkiel before branching toward different sectors of the front. Thatcher's analysis indicated that blocking these routes would effectively isolate German armoured units from their supply bases, forcing them to rely on tactical resupply missions that lacked the capacity to sustain offensive operations. At 0800 hours, on December 26th, 32, P-47 Thunderbolts attacked Stadtkiel in coordinated waves designed to create maximum disruption. The first wave dropped 1,000-pound bombs on the main bridge, crossing the Kiel River, collapsing the stone structure and sending debris into the water that would take days to clear. The second wave strafed a convoy of 43 vehicles caught on the eastern approach road, creating a massive traffic jam that blocked the route completely. The third wave dropped fragmentation bombs on the town's central square, where German military police had established a traffic control point. The resulting chaos created a backup that extended for miles in both directions, with hundreds of trucks stalled on roads that offered no room for maneuvering or dispersal. Captain Martin Stein, flying in the third wave, recorded his observations with clinical precision. The entire town became a parking lot of stationary vehicles. German soldiers abandoned trucks and fled into buildings. We made repeated strafing passes for 20 minutes. Conservative estimate is 120 vehicles destroyed or damaged. The road network is completely blocked. German attempts to bypass the blocked routes revealed the fundamental vulnerability of mechanized warfare in restricted terrain. Alternative roads through the Eifel region were narrow forest tracks that could not support heavy traffic. Attempts to move convoys cross-country resulted in vehicles becoming stuck in muddy fields or damaging their suspensions on rough ground. The Wehrmacht's logistical flexibility, already strained by Allied air superiority, collapsed entirely when key transportation nodes were eliminated. By December 27th, German fuel shortages had become critical throughout the Ardennes sector. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had advanced to within 4 miles of the Meuse River at Dinant, was forced to halt operations when its tanks exhausted their fuel. Supplies and no resupply convoys could reach their positions. Abandoned German tanks began appearing along roads, their crews having siphoned remaining fuel to keep a few vehicles operational, while leaving the rest as useless steel monuments to logistical failure. Oberst Otto Remmer, commanding the Führer Escort Brigade, transmitted a desperate radio message to 5th Panzer Army headquarters that was intercepted and decoded by Allied intelligence. Request immediate fuel resupply. All armoured vehicles stationary. Cannot continue offensive operations without minimum 5,000 gallons. American air attacks have eliminated all daylight supply routes. Request permission to withdraw to defensible positions. The message represented the turning point of Germany's final offensive. For the first time since the attack began on December 16th, German commanders were acknowledging that logistical failure rather than tactical defeat was forcing operational decisions. The Wehrmacht's vaunted mobility, which had conquered most of Europe through rapid mechanized advances, had been neutralized not by superior enemy armor, but by systematic air attacks against supply vehicles that nobody had considered strategically important. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. General Quesada's operations staff compiled comprehensive statistics on the week's air campaign, numbers that would fundamentally reshape tactical air doctrine throughout the remaining months of the war. Between December 23rd and December 29th, 9th Tactical Air Command flew 4,217 ground attack sorties. Pilots claimed 2,893 vehicles destroyed, including 837 confirmed through reconnaissance, photography, and gun camera analysis. The actual total was almost certainly higher. Many destroyed vehicles burned completely or were pushed off roads by German recovery crews, making post-attack reconnaissance unreliable. Damaged vehicles that remained technically repairable often could not be recovered because fuel shortages prevented operation of recovery vehicles. Intelligence analysts estimated that true German vehicle losses exceeded 4,000 during the week, representing approximately 60% of the Wehrmacht's organic transportation capacity in the Ardennes sector. Major Joseph Dillon presented the strategic assessment during the December 29th staff meeting, his voice carrying the satisfaction of an intelligence officer whose analysis had been vindicated by events. Sir, German offensive operations have completely stalled. The 2nd Panzer Division is abandoned equipment at Celles. The 9th Panzer Division cannot advance beyond Marche. Fuel shortages are forcing Wehrmacht commanders to prioritize defensive operations over continued attacks. Quesada studied casualty, reports that told a different story about the human cost of his tactical revolution. American fighter-bomber losses during the week totaled 43 aircraft, primarily to anti-aircraft fire during low-level attack runs. 129 pilots and crew members were dead or missing, casualties that would have been completely avoided if those aircraft had remained at high altitude conducting fighter sweeps. But the mathematical comparison was stark. 43 American aircraft and 129 crew members lost in exchange for over 4,000 German vehicles destroyed, and an entire enemy offensive brought to halt through logistical starvation. The casualty ratio was approximately 30-1 in American favor when measured by strategic impact rather than simple body counts. The Luftwaffe's response to American ground attack tactics revealed the psychological and doctrinal crisis facing German fighter forces in the war's final months. Intercepted radio communications showed increasing frustration among German pilots who found themselves unable to protect supply convoys despite maintaining numerical parity during individual engagements. Hauptmann Franz Stigler, the veteran Luftwaffe pilot, described the tactical helplessness in his post-war memoir. "We could see American fighters attacking our trucks. We could dive toward them and attempt interception, but they operated at altitudes and speeds where our aircraft's advantages disappeared. By the time we reached firing position, they had already destroyed their targets and were climbing away. We were spectators to our own defeat." The fundamental problem was that German fighters had been designed and trained for air superiority missions rather than ground attack interdiction. Messerschmitt 109s excelled at high-altitude interception. Focke-Wulf 190C possessed superior climbing performance and heavy armament for bomber destruction. But neither aircraft type could effectively engage enemy fighters operating at extremely low altitude while conducting high-speed ground attacks. German tactical doctrine had never seriously considered the scenario of defending ground targets against enemy air attack. The Luftwaffe's entire training system emphasized offensive operations and air superiority, assuming that control of the airspace above friendly territory would automatically protect ground forces. When that assumption proved false, German fighter forces lacked the tactics, training, or even the appropriate weaponry to contest American ground attack missions effectively. By January 1, 1945, German supply operations in the Ardennes had shifted entirely to nighttime movements, accepting the reduced capacity and increased accident rates that darkness imposed. Convoys traveled without headlights on icy roads, where navigation errors resulted in vehicles plunging into ditches or colliding with obstacles. Average convoy speed dropped from 30 miles per hour during daylight operations to 8 miles per hour at night, effectively tripling the time required to move supplies from depots to frontline units. American fighter-bomber tactics evolved to exploit even this adaptation. P-61 Black Widow night fighters, equipped with radar and infrared detection systems, began hunting German supply columns during hours of darkness. While these specialized aircraft achieved far fewer kills than daylight operations, their psychological impact was devastating. German drivers understood that no time was truly safe from air attack, creating a pervasive sense of vulnerability that degraded morale and operational effectiveness. Captain Jack Ilfrey led his final mission of the campaign on January 3, 1945, a fighter sweep over eastern Belgium designed to locate and destroy any remaining German supply operations. His formation of 8 P-47 Thunderbolts encountered no enemy fighters during the 3-hour patrol, a stark contrast to the desperate aerial battles that had characterized operations just 3 weeks earlier. The landscape below told the story of logistical collapse more effectively than any intelligence report. Abandoned German vehicles lined roads throughout the region, their crews having walked away when fuel exhaustion made further movement impossible. Burned-out truck hulks marked the locations where American air attacks had caught convoys in the open. Cratered bridges and destroyed road junctions created transportation bottlenecks that would require weeks to repair. Ilfrey's combat journal entry for that day reflected on the psychological transformation that Operations Order 1247 had imposed on fighter pilots throughout the command. 3 weeks ago, I would have considered this mission a failure because we encountered no enemy aircraft. Today, I understand that the absence of German fighters represents success. They're grounded by fuel shortages that resulted directly from our attacks on supply trucks. We won this battle not through aerial combat, but by systematically destroying the logistics that sustain military operations. The campaign's final statistics were compiled in late January, when battlefield conditions had stabilized and assessment teams could conduct detailed analysis. Between December 23, 1944 and January 8, 1945, American fighter bombers in the Ardennes sector claimed 5,793 German vehicles destroyed. Reconnaissance photography confirmed 3,142 of these claims, with the remainder categorized as probable or damaged. Intelligence analysts determined that German transportation capacity in the theater had been reduced by approximately 70%, effectively paralyzing supply operations and forcing Wehrmacht commanders to abandon offensive intentions in favor of defensive withdrawals. The strategic impact extended far beyond the immediate battle. Fuel shortages created during the Ardennes campaign would plague German military operations throughout the war's remaining months, limiting the effectiveness of even successful tactical actions. The human cost of the ground attack campaign was sobering. American fighter bomber losses totaled 68 aircraft destroyed and 37 damaged beyond repair. 193 crew members were killed in action, primarily from anti-aircraft fire during low-altitude attack runs. These casualties represented approximately 4% of the aircraft committed and 6% of the personnel involved, rates that were considered acceptable given the strategic results achieved. German casualties from the air interdiction campaign were more difficult to quantify. Vehicle crews killed during strafing attacks numbered in the thousands, though precise figures were never compiled. More significantly, the logistical failure forced premature abandonment of armored vehicles and heavy equipment that could not be evacuated when fuel supplies were exhausted. German material losses included approximately 400 tanks and assault guns left behind during the retreat from the Ardennes, vehicles that were technically operational but useless without fuel to move them. General Quesada received the Distinguished Service Medal for his role in developing and implementing the ground attack tactics that had proven decisive during the campaign. The citation specifically noted his willingness to abandon traditional fighter doctrine in favor of innovative approaches that maximized air power's strategic impact. But Quesada's most lasting contribution was doctrinal rather than tactical, the recognition that air superiority was meaningless unless it translated into ground-level effects that influenced enemy behavior and capabilities. The lessons of the Ardennes air campaign spread rapidly throughout American tactical air forces. By February 1945, fighter-bomber squadrons across the European theater had adopted ground attack priorities similar to those Quesada had implemented. The Army Air Forces revised its pilot training curriculum to emphasize ground attack techniques and target recognition, moving away from the exclusive focus on aerial combat that had previously dominated fighter pilot education. Captain Jack Ilfrey survived the war with his final tally, standing at 8 aerial victories and 63 confirmed ground vehicles destroyed, making him technically an ace under both the traditional and revised scoring systems. He returned to civilian life in 1946, rarely discussing his combat experiences beyond acknowledging that his most important contributions had nothing to do with dogfighting skill or individual heroics. In a rare interview conducted in 1983, Ilfrey reflected on the psychological difficulty of abandoning fighter pilot culture in favor of strategic effectiveness. We were trained to think of ourselves as knights engaging in honorable individual combat. Operations Order 1247 asked us to become mechanics of destruction, systematically eliminating trucks and supply vehicles that offered no glory or recognition. It was harder than any aerial combat I experienced because it required abandoning our entire sense of professional identity. The tactical revolution that began during the Battle of the Bulge would define close air support doctrine for the remainder of the 20th century. American military forces in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts would emphasize ground attack effectiveness over aerial combat statistics, measuring air power's value by its impact on enemy ground operations rather than aircraft destroyed or pilots killed. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which had achieved fame as a fighter during the early war years, found its true calling as a ground attack platform during the Ardennes campaign and subsequent operations into Germany. The aircraft's rugged construction, heavy armament, and ability to absorb battle damage made it ideally suited for low-altitude operations against heavily defended targets. By war's end, Thunderbolt pilots had claimed over 86,000 German vehicles destroyed, fundamentally crippling Wehrmacht mobility and logistics. But the most profound legacy of the truck-busting campaign was psychological rather than tactical. Allied air forces demonstrated that modern warfare required abandoning romantic notions of individual combat in favor of systematic approaches that prioritized strategic effectiveness over personal glory. The fighter pilot ace, while still celebrated in popular culture, became less relevant to actual military outcomes than the ground attack specialist who could identify and destroy the logistics infrastructure that sustained enemy operations. German military analysts, conducting post-war assessments of why their forces had been defeated despite often superior tactics and equipment, identified air interdiction of supply lines as the decisive factor that negated battlefield successes. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces during the Ardennes offensive, stated in his Allied interrogation that the campaign failed not because American ground forces defeated German armor, but because American air forces destroyed the trucks that carried fuel to German tanks. The mathematics were simple and inescapable. Modern mechanized warfare consumed vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and supplies that had to be transported from rear area depots to frontline units. Destroying the transportation network was strategically equivalent to destroying the combat units themselves, but far easier to accomplish given the vulnerability of unarmored supply vehicles to air attack. Every fuel truck destroyed represented multiple tanks rendered immobile. Every ammunition carrier eliminated meant artillery batteries reduced to silence. The truck-busting campaign of December 1944 to January 1945 represented warfare's transformation from romantic individual combat to industrial systems management. Air power's value lay not in the skill of individual pilots or the drama of aerial dogfights, but in the systematic application of overwhelming force against vulnerable elements of the enemy's logistical structure. The revolution required abandoning cherished traditions and cultural assumptions, but it delivered strategic results that traditional fighter tactics could never achieve. Captain Jack Ilfrey's decision to ignore enemy fighters and dive toward German supply trucks on December 7, 1944, seemed like cowardice to pilots trained in traditional fighter doctrine. But that single action, multiplied across thousands of missions flown by hundreds of pilots over 3 weeks of intensive operations, destroyed 800 German trucks, immobilized an entire panzer army, demonstrated that winning wars required strategic vision rather than tactical prowess or individual courage. The German soldiers who abandoned their fuel-starved tanks in the forests of Belgium never saw the American fighter pilots who had sealed their fate by destroying supply convoys miles behind the front lines. The Luftwaffe pilots who circled helplessly overhead while their supply trucks burned could not understand how they had lost air superiority despite maintaining numerical parity during individual engagements. The Wehrmacht commanders who planned the Ardennes offensive with such precision had never considered that their most critical vulnerability was not American armor or infantry, but the transportation network that sustained their mechanized forces. In the frozen forests of Belgium during the winter of 1944 to 1945, American tactical air forces learned a lesson that would define modern warfare for generations. Victory belonged not to those who achieved the most dramatic individual achievements, but to those who systematically destroyed the enemy's ability to sustain military operations. The 800 trucks destroyed during the campaign's first week mattered more than 1,000 aerial victories would have. because those trucks carried the fuel that powered Germany's final offensive and the ammunition that sustained its defensive positions. General Pete Quesada's revolutionary order to ignore enemy fighters and prioritize ground targets represented military thinking at its finest, the willingness to abandon cherished traditions and institutional assumptions in favor of approaches that actually accomplished strategic objectives. The fighter pilots who reluctantly accepted this doctrinal transformation gave up opportunities for individual glory and accepted increased casualties from anti-aircraft fire. But they won the campaign and shortened the war by demonstrating that air power's true value lay in disrupting enemy logistics rather than achieving air superiority for its own sake. The Battle of the Bulge would be remembered for dramatic moments like the siege of Bastogne and General Patton's relief column breaking through German encirclement. But the decisive factor was the systematic destruction of German supply vehicles by fighter pilots who had learned to ignore their instincts, abandon their training, and focus on unglamorous targets that offered no recognition or honor. 800 trucks destroyed in 7 days ended Germany's final offensive and vindicated a tactical revolution that transformed how air power would be employed for the remainder of the century. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.